Well, hello and welcome to episode 6 of Year with Jesus. Every few days, near to where I live, I drive past a building site. It's going to be 7 levels high when it's finished, but it's just been a hole in the ground for months. And every day there's dozens of workers in high-vis overalls who come and do more inside that hole. Don't ask me what. I'm no civil engineer, but I did find this. Make sense to you? Me neither. But if you can figure it out, and if you ever decide to build a multi-level apartment block, you know how deep your hole should be. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, when are they going to start building? Perhaps you've been thinking this about your year with Jesus. When are we going to start on Jesus' actual life? Well, I'm excited to announce that next week we will have finished our foundations and we will build our first visible level, which is, of course, the birth of Jesus. But I want to spend just one more session laying some important context. If we can grasp some of this, then when we launch into Jesus' life and teaching, you'll be able to link it back to these first 6 foundational episodes. Last episode, I introduced the humanity of Jesus. I made mention of the genealogies that appear at the beginning of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. In this episode, I want to zoom in a little bit on Matthew's genealogy. After detailing all the main characters in the genealogy, Matthew divides the timeline into 3 major time periods. Thus, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. So let's go back to the chart that I introduced in episode 4, and let's overlay Matthew's genealogy over the top of the chart. We have the person of Abraham and the 14 generations after him. Then we have the person of David and the 14 generations after him. Then we have an event, the invasion of the Babylonians, the enslavement of the Jews, and them being taken away into exile. Then there are 14 generations from the exile to Christ. And the story of these generations and their associated events is captured in what Christians call the Old Testament. Both the Jewish scriptures and the Old Testament section of the Christian Bible are very, very similar, but the order is different. And also in the Jewish scriptures, some books are grouped together as one book, so there ends up being fewer books. It's worth noting here that most of the Bible covers around 2,000 years of history. And although one book follows another, they are not necessarily chronological. The Christian Bible groups the books into 4 main sections: the books of the law, the history books, the poetic books, the prophetic books, and this prophetic section is further divided into the major prophets and the minor prophets. Now, the words major and minor refer to the length of the prophecies, not to any relevant importance. So it's possible to have 3 types of books happening on the historical timeline at any one time. You'll have an historical record of the event in one book, a poem or a song in another book, and a prophecy that was given at the time in another book. So now back to Matthew's genealogical list. When Matthew refers specifically to Abraham and to David, he is tying Jesus' history directly to 2 of the 3 most influential figures in the Hebrew Scriptures, Abraham and David. The other key character from the Hebrew Scriptures is Moses, and we'll talk about him more in another episode. It's important to keep in mind the gospel writers were Jewish. Their primary reading audience, at least early on, was Jewish, and a sense of history and context has always been incredibly important to Jewish people. Additionally, the author is seeking to present Jesus not only as a real person, but as a true Jew. He is from a particular tribal group, the tribe of Judah, dating back to King David, and he's a descendant of Abraham, the spiritual and physical ancestor of the Jewish people. It's also helpful for those of us who are non-Jews to be reminded of the fact that Jesus came as a Jew, and Jesus, as a descendant of Abraham, is central to the fulfillment of the promise that God gave to Abraham. Let's have a look at that call now. The Lord has said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people and your father's household, to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. God said to Abraham, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I've made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. Covenants in the ancient Near East were solemn, binding agreements expressing mutual trust and commitment, and were used in relationships as varied as a marriage bond and an international treaty. God's covenant and commitment here is not only to Abraham, but to his descendants. Jesus, in terms of his earthly nature, is a descendant of Abraham's line. Thus, he is an inheritor of the promise to Abraham. And as we work through the Gospels, we will see that Jesus is not only an inheritor of the promise to Abraham, but that he fulfills it. In particular, Jesus was a light to the nations, all nations. This was part of the original call to Abraham. Moving on. Abraham's grandson had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. One of those tribes was Judah. A young boy, David, was part of this tribe and was anointed to be king in Israel. Towards the end of his life, he sets out to build a great temple so that the people have somewhere they can worship God. But God had other ideas. And the prophet Nathan comes to the king and says, when your days are over and you go to be with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He's the one who will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I will never take my love away from him as I took it away from your predecessor. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever. Now, David did have a son. His name was Solomon, and he did build a temple. But two things happened that make you question the full meaning of this prophecy. One is Solomon's reign came to an end. It was not an eternal kingdom. In fact, within a short time, the kingdom becomes split in two. There's a civil war, and both kingdoms end up being a shadow of their former selves. Secondly, the house or temple that Solomon had built ended up being destroyed by the invading Babylonians in 587 BC, which begs the question, who is David's descendant that would build a house for the Lord? If it's not Solomon, who is it? There's this national longing within Israel for another son of David who would finally rebuild God's house and establish God's kingdom forever. This longing was brought into even sharper focus during and after the exile of Israel into Babylon, because the national dream of being a light and a blessing to the nations appeared to be in tatters. At the time of the Gospels, the elephant in the room was, who is the king who would usher in an eternal kingdom? And when and how were Israel's hopes of being a great nation going to be realized? As far as the gospel writers were concerned, the answer to these two questions was one word: Jesus. And their record of Jesus' own words leaves us in no doubt that Jesus saw himself as the fulfillment of the hope of Israel. And as we move through the life and teaching of Jesus, we'll be looking at some of that. But for now, let's wrap it up, and I'll see you in the next episode.